He was abducted by aliens on his farm. In 1957, Antônio Vilas-Boas told a story no one believed. October 16, 1957, a humid night in rural Minas Gerais, Brazil. Antônio Vilas-Boas, a 23-year-old farmer, had just hitched his tractor under a black sky, still pulsing with heat from the day. Working late to avoid the sun, he noticed something strange above his fields, a red light that shimmered, then began to descend. At first, he thought it was a star, but as it grew larger, moving against the wind with mechanical precision, he knew he was wrong. The object stopped above his tractor and hovered silently. Then the engine cut out. Panicked, he tried to flee, but his body felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. Behind him, the glowing object settled into the earth on 3 legs, casting an eerie crimson hue across the tilled soil. That's when he saw them. Small figures moving fast, their movements deliberate, mechanical. In those first disorienting seconds, Antônio realized he wasn't alone on his land. What happened next would mark the beginning of one of the earliest and most controversial abduction cases in recorded history. A case so detailed and so bizarre, it would leave even seasoned investigators divided for decades. To understand what really happened in the remote Brazilian field, we need to go back to the exact moment when ordinary life collapsed into something utterly unexplainable. The rolling farmland of southeastern Brazil moved at its own rhythm in the 1950s. Hot days, long harvest, and a life ruled by soil in season. In these quiet rural pockets, families lived by the land with little concern for the outside world. It was a time of kerosene lamps, transistor radios, and news that traveled slower than the crops grew. Antônio Vilas-Boas, just 23, was known for his discipline. He wasn't a dreamer or a man drawn to superstition. He worked the fields late into the night, partly to escape the punishing heat, partly because there was always more work than daylight. Those who knew him described him as serious, reserved, and unusually driven for his age, especially in a region where many young men sought easier paths away from the farms. His family's property stretched along the edge of São Francisco de Sales, a sleepy town in Minas Gerais, where the night air was thick with crickets and the occasional distant bark of a stray dog. There was a place where UFOs were unknown, and talk of anything beyond this world was more likely to draw laughter than concern. And yet, for weeks leading up to that night, there had been murmurs, faint stories of red lights hovering silently over nearby fields. A local farmhand claimed his cattle were restless, spooked by something unseen. Others spoke of strange equipment failures, as if something was interfering with radios and tractor engines. Most of it was dismissed, of course. People here had weathered enough storms to know how easily gossip spreads when crops fail or nights grow too quiet. But for Antônio, the night those lights returned wasn't a tale passed down over coffee. It wasn't something he could ignore or rationalize. It would become something else entirely, because when the silence was broken, it didn't come with sound. It came with movement, precision, silence, and intent. And from that point forward, nothing in his life or in the story of modern UFO encounters would ever be the same. The moment the red glow flooded the farmland, Antônio ran, his boots pounding against the dirt. But something was wrong. His limbs moved as if through molasses. Behind him, he could hear a low hum, almost mechanical, but with a pulse, like it was breathing. Then came the figures. They were small, no taller than 5 feet, and moved with a precision that defied instinct. Encased in tight, gray suits and helmets that masked their faces, they advanced in silence. Antônio struggled, swinging wildly, but their grip was overwhelming. He was dragged toward the craft, its surface metallic and glowing, shaped like an elongated egg with a dome that rotated steadily. He was forced up a ladder and into a narrow hallway filled with a strange bluish light. The air in sight felt chemically altered, thick, artificial. They took his clothes and covered his body in a gel-like substance. He remembered feeling cold, exposed, and utterly powerless. There was no sound, no communication, just a quiet efficiency of beings carrying out something that felt rehearsed. Then came the blood sample. One of the beings brought a device and pressed it against his chin. They punctured through the skin. He said later it felt like fire. They took his sample without reaction, then left him alone in a dim room that smelled of metal and disinfectant. That's when she entered. By Antonia's account, she looked human, but not quite. Tall, striking, with long white blonde hair, and unnaturally large slanted blue eyes that gave off an almost feline quality. She said nothing. She simply moved toward him. What followed was something he would recount for the rest of his life with a mix of awe, shame, and disbelief. They had sex, or at least that's how he described it. The encounter was wordless, mechanical, but unmistakably biological. Afterward, she stood, pointed at her belly, then upward toward the sky. He believed the gesture meant she would carry the child somewhere beyond Earth. Then, the beings returned. They handed him his clothes, led him through the ship, and gestured at various devices, perhaps trying to explain them, or perhaps just following a procedure. When he tried to take a small object, shaped like a clock, as proof, they took it back with surprising force. He was led back down the ramp and released into the darkness. The ship lifted slowly, without sound, and vanished into the sky. 4 hours had passed. When he reached home, Antônio was dazed, nauseous, and trembling. In the days that followed, he developed strange symptoms: burns on his skin, weakness, pounding headaches. His mother noted that his eyes seemed oddly sensitive to light. His skin erupted with small lesions that oozed a yellowish discharge. But what disturbed him most wasn't what he saw. It was how intentional it all felt. Not chaotic, not spontaneous. It was as if the entire event had been carried out with precision. This wasn't a dream. Not to him. But who or what would go to such lengths? And why choose an unknown farmer in the middle of Brazil? Those questions would soon draw investigators, doctors, and skeptics alike. And what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. Word of Antônio Vilas-Boas' encounter did immediately spread beyond local whispers. In fact, he kept the story to himself for several months until a journalist, José Martins, connected him with Dr. Olavo Fontes, a physician and member of the Brazilian National School of Medicine. That decision changed everything. Dr. Fontes conducted a full medical evaluation and later concluded that Antônio showed signs of exposure to mild radiation. He noted strange skin lesions, small reddish nodules that oozed a yellowish fluid, which appeared without bruising. Antônio also reported symptoms like nausea, extreme fatigue, and light sensitivity, conditions Fontes attributed to radiation sickness, but no environmental source for such exposure was ever identified. Still, skepticism came quickly. Many in the medical community dismissed Fontes' diagnosis as speculative. Others pointed to the delay in reporting the case as reason to doubt its credibility. With no physical traces left on the farm, no burn marks, no impressions in the soil, no photographic evidence, the story rested almost entirely on Antônio's account and his medical symptoms. And that was part of what made it so difficult to dismiss. Antônio never wavered. Over decades, through interviews, scrutiny, and public ridicule, he maintained every detail without contradiction. Even after becoming a lawyer and building a professional life, he never tried to capitalize on the story. Those close to him described him as sincere, intelligent, and deeply affected by the experience. Still, doubts lingered. Was it possible he fabricated the entire account after reading similar reports in foreign magazines? Researcher Peter Rogerson later suggested that Antônio may have been influenced by a story published in the Brazilian magazine, O Cruzeiro, which had recently translated tales of American contactee experiences. If so, the timing was suspiciously close, but others saw it differently. Ufologists point to the sheer strangeness of the account, the sexual encounter, the blood sampling, the repeated symptoms, as too specific and consistent to be lifted from common lore. In fact, Antônio's case preceded most well-known abduction narratives, including the famous Betty and Barney Hill case by several years. Then came another theory, one that still unsettles researchers today. In the 1990s, former CIA employee Bosko Nodalkovic told author and researcher Rich Reynolds that he believed Antônio had been the subject of a covert psychological experiment. According to noted Kovic, the US and Brazilian governments were collaborating on mind control trials involving hallucinogens, stage environments, and false abduction scenarios to test behavior under extreme conditions. In this version, the aliens were actors, the craft a military decoy, and the symptoms real but artificially induced. There's no hard evidence backing Otto Kovic's claim, but it aligns disturbingly well with the era's growing archive of secret experiments, MKUltra, remote viewing programs, and biobehavioral research conducted without consent. So what are we left with? An intelligent young man who never recanted, medical symptoms that align with radiation exposure, a case that, depending on who you ask, was either the first credible alien abduction in modern history or a carefully orchestrated deception. To this day, no official explanation accounts for what happened to Antônio Vilas-Boas. There were no verified photographs, no conclusive physical traces, just a young man's detailed testimony, the strange marks left on his body, and a consistency in his story that never wavered, not once in over 3 decades. For some, that's enough. They see a case that foreshadowed the global abduction narratives that would come years later: missing time, hybrid reproduction, radiation exposure. They view Antônio not as an outlier, but as a beginning. For others, his account remains deeply flawed. They point to cultural influences, psychological possibilities, and even covert government involvement. And they ask, how could something so extraordinary leave behind so little proof? What we know is that Antônio was changed. He carried that experience through the rest of his life, not for fame or attention, but because, as he said, it happened. And perhaps that's what makes this case so difficult to dismiss. Because whether you believe he was visited by something beyond this world or targeted by something from within it, the scars, emotional and physical, were real. So we're left with the question, was Antônio telling the truth about something unimaginable, or did he unknowingly become part of a story much bigger and darker than we've ever been told? What's your theory? Let us know below. And as always, stay curious. Do you believe Antônio was truly abducted by something not of this world? Or could his experience have been part of a disturbing human experiment? Share your thoughts in the comments below.